Okay, so you ready to dive into this EU AI Act?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. It's this, pretty huge piece of legislation that's been making, a lot of noise in the tech world. People are saying it's like, the EU kind of like, setting a global standard for AI.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because the EU is kind of like, taking the reins here
Yeah.
and being proactive about shaping the future of AI.
Right.
Before you know, we end up in some like Black Mirror episode or something.
Exactly. And they're not messing around, right?
Right.
Like Article 5 straight up bans certain AI practices, and some of this stuff is like, whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, like AI systems that are designed to manipulate people, like subliminally.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's getting into some serious
Or I
territory.
know, right?
Like we've all seen those targeted ads that are like a little creepy,
Yeah,
where it's like they know you better than you know yourself.
right.
But imagine that like amplified to the point where AI is like subtly nudging your decisions
Yeah.
and you're not even aware of it.
It's like mind control.
Right.
That's scary.
That's what the EU is trying to prevent.
Okay, so how do they actually plan to enforce this? Like, do they have like an AI police force?
Well, not exactly, but
Oh,
they have this really interesting system they're using. It's called risk-based classification.
okay.
And basically, they're categorizing AI applications
Mm.
based on, how much potential they have to cause harm.
So like a safety rating system for AI.
Exactly. From, like minimal risk to like absolutely unacceptable.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me, like what kind of AI falls into each category.
Okay, so let's start with like the unacceptable risk.
Okay.
This is like the red zone,
Okay.
the stuff that's just too dangerous to be allowed.
Okay.
Things like social scoring systems,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
where you're being judged based on your behavior,
Right.
or AI that could be used for mass surveillance
Yeah.
without, proper safeguards.
Yeah.
The EU is like drawing a hard line
Right.
against these kinds of applications.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about all the stuff in between? There's got to be tons of AI applications that aren't like inherently evil,
Oh.
but could still, pose some risks.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
That's where the high-risk category comes in.
Okay.
This is for AI that's used in areas where if it makes a mistake,
Yeah.
it could have really serious consequences.
Oh, okay.
Things like healthcare,
Right.
law enforcement,
Yeah.
financial systems.
Uh-huh.
Imagine an AI system that's used to diagnose medical conditions
Yeah.
or make decisions about loans.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Getting those things wrong
Yeah,
could have like a huge impact on people's lives.
totally. So higher risk AI gets put under a more powerful microscope,
Yeah.
more regulations, stricter testing.
That's the idea.
Okay.
The Act outlines specific requirements
Right.
for these high-risk systems,
Mm-hmm.
and they're really focused on things like data quality, transparency, and human oversight.
Mm.
It's like they're saying, look, if you're going to use AI in these really sensitive areas,
Mm.
you got to be extra careful. Make sure it's safe, reliable, and fair.
That makes sense. It's like you wouldn't want your self-driving car being like beta tested on the freeway during rush hour.
Yeah.
Speaking of testing, how do they actually determine which AI applications fall into which category?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's one of the most challenging parts of the Act
Okay.
because figuring out how risky a complex AI system is,
Yeah,
it's not always super straightforward.
I can imagine.
It requires a deep understanding of the technology itself,
Yeah.
how it's going to be used,
Yeah.
and like the bigger societal context.
So it's not just about the algorithm, but also about how it's used and who it affects.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's where things can get a little tricky
Yeah.
because the EU is going to need to develop
Yeah.
really clear guidelines and methodologies
Mm.
for how to assess risk.
Right.
And there's probably going to be a lot of debate
I bet.
about the best way to do that.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to predict the future. You never really know how a technology is going to be used or what the unintended consequences might be.
Exactly. That's the challenge with regulating any new technology,
Right.
especially something as powerful as AI.
Yeah.
But the EU is trying to be proactive
Okay.
by putting these guidelines in place
Yeah.
and trying to anticipate the risks.
So even though there might be some gray areas and challenges in figuring out how to implement all of this, the overall goal is to create a framework that encourages innovation,
Yes,
but also protects people from harm.
exactly.
Okay, so they've got these prohibited practices, they've got this risk-based classification system,
Right,
but it's not just about protecting people within the EU.
right. This act actually has what's called extraterritorial reach.
Okay, now you're just using fancy legal jargon to make me feel dumb.
Sorry.
What does extraterritorial reach actually mean?
Okay, so basically it means that the EU is extending its ethical umbrella
Okay.
beyond its own borders.
So, like, even if a company isn't based in the EU, they still have to follow the AI Act
Yeah.
if their AI system impacts EU citizens.
Exactly.
Wow, that's pretty big.
It is.
So, like, if some tech giant in Silicon Valley develops an AI-powered app that's used by people in Europe, they have to follow the EU's rules.
That's right.
Wow.
The EU is basically saying, look, if you want to play in our sandbox,
Yeah.
you got to play by our rules.
It's like a power move.
It is.
So this isn't just some regional policy. The EU is aiming to set a global standard for ethical AI.
Yeah, that's the big picture here.
Wow.
The EU is positioning itself as a leader in AI governance.
Okay.
And this act could have a major impact on how AI is developed and regulated around the world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, from subliminal manipulation to global standards. This EU AI Act is like a wild ride. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's zoom back in on those prohibited practices for a minute. What exactly is on the EU's AI naughty list?
So we've talked about subliminal manipulation and social scoring, but there's more.
Okay.
The act also prohibits using AI to exploit vulnerable groups.
Okay, hold on. What does that mean in practice? Give me like a real-world example.
Okay, so imagine an AI system that's designed to target advertising to children.
Okay.
You know, taking advantage of their lack of critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
Or how easily they can be persuaded.
Right.
Or like an AI-powered loan application system that discriminates against people based on their socioeconomic status.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or their past financial struggles.
I see what you mean.
That's where the ethical considerations become really clear.
Yeah.
It's not just about theoretical risks anymore.
Right.
It's about protecting real people from real harm.
Okay, that makes sense. So they're saying some applications of AI are just off limits.
Exactly.
No matter how profitable they might be
Yeah.
or how technologically impressive.
It's about drawing a line in the sand
Yeah.
and saying certain things are just not okay.
I can see that, but I can also see the other side of the argument too, where people might say that these kinds of prohibitions could stifle innovation
Right.
and prevent the development of AI applications that could actually be beneficial.
Yeah, it's a tough balance
Yeah.
between fostering innovation
Right.
and protecting people from harm.
Exactly.
That's why this act has sparked so much debate.
I bet.
There are valid arguments on both sides.
Right.
And finding the right balance is going to be super important
Yeah.
as we figure out this whole AI thing.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've explored kind of like the high-level goals of the EU AI Act, the potential global impact, and those specific practices that they're saying are just like, no way.
Right.
But there's still so much more to unpack, so stay with us, folks, because in the next part, we're going to dive deeper into how this risk-based system actually works in practice.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so we've got this risk-based approach to AI regulation in the EU. But how do they actually decide, like, which AI applications are considered high risk?
Well, it's not as simple as, just like putting a label on something.
Right.
The act lays out some specific criteria
Okay.
for figuring out which AI systems are high risk.
Okay.
And it looks at things like, what the AI is actually going to be used for.
Right.
Like, what's its purpose? What could happen if it malfunctions?
Okay.
How many people could be affected?
Yeah, so like a facial recognition algorithm
Yeah.
used for security at an airport might be considered lower risk
Yeah.
than the same algorithm used for mass surveillance.
Exactly. Context is super important.
Right.
And that's where it gets tricky because assessing risk isn't always like black and white.
Right.
You have to make judgments
Yeah.
and weigh different factors.
So how do they actually navigate those gray areas? Like, do they have a room full of AI ethicists?
But it's not quite like that.
Okay.
But the act does call for creating these expert groups
Okay.
and advisory bodies to give guidance on how to assess risk.
So they're not just like winging it.
No, they're trying to be as systematic as possible.
Okay.
And these groups will be developing methodologies and
Right.
standards for evaluating AI systems
That makes sense.
and making recommendations on how to mitigate potential risks.
So it's a collaborative effort.
Yeah, it's not just policymakers.
Right.
It's also technical experts, researchers, industry stakeholders.
They're bringing everyone to the table.
Exactly. Because the EU recognizes that regulating AI effectively,
Yeah.
you need input from a lot of different perspectives.
Makes sense. What about the companies that are actually developing these AI systems? What are their responsibilities?
Well, the Act puts a lot of responsibility on AI developers and providers.
Okay.
They have to do their own risk assessments,
Okay.
implement safety measures,
Uh-huh.
and make sure their systems meet the EU's standards
Okay.
for things like transparency and accountability.
So no more move fast and break things in the EU?
Not when it comes to high-risk AI.
Mhm.
The Act is all about being cautious and responsible,
Oh, okay.
putting safety and ethics first.
But can they really police every single company, like every line of code?
That's always the challenge with regulation, right?
Yeah.
Enforcement is a big one,
Okay.
and the AI Act is no different.
So what happens if a company breaks the rules?
Well, the Act has provisions for fines
Okay.
and other penalties.
So there are consequences.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The EU is serious about this.
We're not messing around.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about data for a second. Because AI systems are only as good as the data they're trained on.
That's a really important point.
Right.
The quality of data is crucial in AI development.
Okay.
If you train an AI system on bad data,
Yeah.
you're going to get bad results.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
So does the Act address this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Article 10 is all about data quality.
Okay.
It talks about how important it is to use data that's relevant, representative, and free from bias. And it also calls for measures to protect data security and privacy.
So it's not just regulating the algorithms. It's
No.
also regulating the data.
It's about the whole ecosystem.
Because data bias can be so sneaky.
Yeah, it's not always intentional discrimination.
Right.
Sometimes it's just reflecting existing societal biases.
Right, and that's like baked into the data.
Exactly.
And that's why the Act calls for ongoing monitoring of these AI systems.
Oh, right.
It's not enough to just check the data once.
Right. You need to keep an eye on things.
Right.
Make sure the system is performing the way it should.
Yeah?
And if you see any bias or unfair outcomes, you need to make adjustments.
It's like a constant checkup.
Yeah, a feedback loop.
So the AI doesn't go rogue.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a pretty holistic approach, considering like the entire life cycle of AI development.
It is.
From the data to the algorithms to the actual use.
Right. It's a new era of regulation.
Okay, so we've talked about the how, like how the EU is actually going to do all of this. But let's talk about the why for a minute. Why is the EU going to all this trouble?
Well, at its core, the EU AI Act is about shaping the future of AI
Okay.
in a way that benefits everyone.
So it's not about being afraid of AI.
No, it's about using it responsibly.
Right.
Making sure it respects human rights, promotes fairness, and builds trust.
So it's about guiding AI in the right direction.
Exactly.
Not trying to stop it altogether.
Right. The EU recognizes that AI has incredible potential to solve problems, improve our lives,
Right.
create new opportunities.
But it's also powerful.
It is.
And we need to be careful.
We need to be smart about how we use it.
Okay, so the EU has laid out its vision, but AI is a global thing.
Right.
What kind of impact could this have beyond the EU?
That's the big question everyone's asking.
Yeah.
Some people think the EU AI Act could become the global standard.
Really?
Yeah, it could influence how other countries regulate AI.
So the EU is kind of like setting the trend.
They're definitely trying to...
Yeah, and other countries might follow suit.
It's possible.
Because they don't want to be left behind.
Right? The EU is sending a strong message.
Yeah.
They're saying, this is how we think AI should be done.
Okay, but let's be real. Not everyone is going to be happy about this.
Of course not.
Right.
There are concerns about overregulation.
Yeah.
And how complex this is all going to be to implement.
Right.
And how to balance ethics with innovation.
It's a lot to consider.
It is.
So we're probably going to see a mix of reactions.
Yes, some people will be on board,
Yeah.
others will be hesitant,
Okay.
and some will be completely against it.
It's like anything else, right?
Exactly.
People have different opinions.
And different priorities.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Not when it comes to something as complex as AI.
But the EU AI Act is a big step
Yeah,
in the
you get-
global conversation about AI ethics. And it's going to have an impact.
There's no doubt about that.
All right, so we've been through a lot with this EU AI Act, from the nitty-gritty details to the big picture implications. But before we wrap up, let's try to distill all of this down. Like, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the biggest one is that the EU is not playing around.
Right.
They are serious about ethical AI.
Yeah.
This isn't just some vague statement of principles.
Right.
This is a real legal framework
Uh-huh.
with real consequences.
They're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly.
And the tech world is definitely taking notice.
Oh, yeah. They're paying attention.
It's like a wake-up call.
It is.
Like, hey, if you want to be a part of this,
Yeah.
you got to step up your game.
You got to play by the rules.
But it's more than just rules, right?
It's a whole new mindset.
Okay.
It's about shifting from a focus on just innovation to a focus on human values.
Okay.
Fairness, accountability.
It's like they're saying, okay, we get it, AI is cool,
Yeah.
but let's not forget about the humans.
Exactly. Let's make sure AI is actually benefiting people.
Right. Not just making a few companies rich.
Yeah. That's a big part of it.
So if you had to sum up the EU AI Act
Yeah.
in like a couple of sentences.
Okay. It's about making sure that AI is developed and used in a way that benefits everyone
Okay.
and protects people from harm.
All right. So that's the goal. But this is just the beginning, right?
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
the AI landscape is constantly changing.
It's moving so fast.
So the act is going to have to evolve too.
Absolutely. This isn't a one-and-done situation.
Right.
They're going to have to keep monitoring things and making adjustments as needed.
It's like a living document.
It has to be.
So what do you think? Is the EU setting a trend here?
I think it's definitely possible.
Okay.
They're setting a pretty strong signal
Yeah.
about what they think is important.
Uh-huh.
And other countries are going to have to decide whether they want to follow suit.
Or go their own way.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Because there are definitely some different perspectives out there.
Oh, yeah.
Some people are worried about overregulation.
Right. They're worried about stifling innovation.
Right.
And others are saying this isn't enough.
It's a tough balance.
It is.
But I think it's great that we're having this conversation.
I agree. It's an important one.
So deep divers, that's our deep dive into the EU AI Act. We've covered a lot of ground, but we've only just scratched the surface. This is a topic that we're going to be talking about for a long time, so stay tuned for more deep dives in the future. And in the meantime, keep those thinking caps on.
And stay curious.
Because the future of AI is in our hands.